David Marples is a professor of Russian and East European history at the University of Alberta. He joins me now live from Edmonton in Canada. Thanks very much for joining us here on TRT World, Professor. The big question here is, what more can NATO do to contain Russian aggression? It's been almost 8 months since the war in Ukraine began, but NATO's stance has pretty much remained the same. It continues to stand in solidarity with Ukraine and make promises to provide more advanced weapons. But in reality, what has this really done in containing Russian aggression? Do you think it's about time for NATO to rethink its strategy in Ukraine?
It's hard to tell because if NATO does that, it's regarded as a form of escalation and Russia could react even more severely. I think that so far in the campaign, the Ukrainians have been quite successful, particularly lately, and they've been relying on weapons coming in from Western countries to turn the tide of the war in areas like Kherson and the Donbass. And I don't think NATO really needs to do a whole lot more. The war may drag on. I don't think we can do much about that. But I think NATO really cannot afford to get too more involved in this war. It doesn't want to actually attack Russian territory. It doesn't really want to provide a sort of closed sky zone or anything of that nature, which would be regarded as much more of an offensive nature. NATO has been quite restrained in this regard so far. And the results have been reasonable, I think probably better than they expected them to be.
Okay, but what is President Putin's end game here? For example, he has achieved some of his major objectives as part of his so-called military operation. He has annexed the major parts of eastern side of Ukraine. Now, where does he stop?
Well, I think he's limited now in how much that can be done. I mean, things like the missile attack over the weekend is really extravagant in terms of how much you're spending on military escalation, and Russia cannot afford to keep doing that. It simply cannot. No state really could afford to keep doing it on that kind of a scale. He's not achieved his objectives in terms of bringing the Ukrainian government to seek an armistice. In fact, Ukraine is even more determined to continue after this sort of attack than it was before. So I think Putin has failed in his basic objectives. I agree that he's annexed, quote unquote, three different regions. But I would say of those regions, only the Donbass was under Russian control firmly at all. Certainly Kherson and Zaporizhia, Russia is only partially occupied, and Ukraine is daily taking more and more villages from Kherson away from Russia. So that Russia, in effect, is limited in what it's achieved, and Ukraine has achieved some success. And I would say the bigger question is how far the Ukrainian army can go, what it intends to do, whether it can actually take places like the city of Kherson or even the city of Donetsk, which would have been inconceivable back in February, but now is being touted as perhaps realistic. So I think what we should be looking for really is a question of what Ukraine is prepared to do in terms of coming to some kind of armistice, and with what Putin will be satisfied. And if Putin is not satisfied and he continues to suffer these kind of defeats, I think things will look very shaky for Putin within the Kremlin, where there are people who want to pursue a much more aggressive policy than even he is doing.
All right, Professor David Marples, thank you very much.